Spotlight on America presents a toxic battleground
15,000 gallons a day of milk
that you're throwing away.
that we're throwing away, we were dumping.
A contamination crisis threatening our farms and our food supply.
This is not just some sort of theoretical problem. This stuff is really bad. It's dangerous.
The culprit, the U.S. military.
Well, imagine if your neighbor called and said, hey, I'm going to start sending toxic waste into your backyard, just letting you know. That's ridiculous, right?
Children at risk.
The metals don't make the children obviously sick, but the chemicals are in their body. It's silent damage.
Top brands of baby food found to contain heavy metals.
We said, well, you have a problem. They said, well, no, we don't.
We explore charges of government inaction that may be exposing kids to dangerous toxins. And NFL Hall of Famer Dave Robinson making one more run at greatness.
How many concussions do you think you had?
Oh, more than you have fingers and toes.
On a mission to prove a new treatment to help heal concussions may be a game changer for thousands of football players, veterans, and many others impacted by traumatic brain injuries. The quiet town of Clovis sits in the plains of eastern New Mexico, just 10 miles from the edge of the Texas Panhandle. It's the kind of place where you're more likely to see cows than people, which makes sense considering the area has long been known mostly for two things: the farms that dominate the community and the giant Air Force base that put it on the map. Now it's also a battlefield in a nationwide war against highly toxic man-made chemicals that may be threatening our food supply. Twice a day, like clockwork, hundreds of cows are herded into this milking parlor on Highland Dairy Farm. Crews make quick work getting each one online and then watch as the lifeblood of this farm is pumped out gallon by gallon. But since late 2018, all of this effort has been futile. Farmer Art Scott told us he can't sell an ounce of this milk.
15,000 gallons a day of milk
That you're throwing away.
that we're throwing away, we were dumping.
And what's the monetary cost of that?
Oh, I'm thinking it's about $8 million to $10 million a year of value.
We watched as waterfalls of white milk flowed down the drain. All Art sees are dollar signs. Money he says he's lost since agricultural officials in New Mexico declared his milk contaminated. Testing revealed high levels of what are known as PFAS chemicals, toxins that have been linked to cancer and many other health problems in humans. For Art, it was a stunning discovery, but in his mind, there's no longer any mystery about the source of the problem.
This is where the PFAS is coming from, right in this area.
His property is located right next door to Cannon Air Force Base, a sprawling facility that sits on nearly 4,000 acres. Art Scott contends the PFAS that's tainted his property can be traced directly back to Cannon, which, like many bases across the country, has long used a toxic firefighting foam that contains PFAS chemicals. Environmental records show a toxic underground plume of chemicals spread over the years beyond the fences of this base and leaked into his groundwater. That contaminated the water that goes to his cows and worked its way into the irrigated crops that feed them. And the outcome, as we saw while touring Scott's property, is devastating. Because his cows can't be used for milk or sold for meat, they're now wasting away. Art says some 1,600 have died in the past 3 years and now fill pits he's been forced to dig on his property.
So we're in the process of covering these up right now.
But Art, this is tragic. I mean, this is your livelihood and you're just watching them die.
Mm-hmm.
Does it hit you?
Yeah, I mean, it's overwhelming. This is their doing, and they're not being held accountable for it. That's the sad part. We're having to take care of their problem.
It's a problem that's impacting hundreds of military bases from coast to coast that use this same toxic firefighting foam. And it's putting not just service members at risk, but also the surrounding communities. So far, Congress has only managed to get the Pentagon to start sending notification letters like this one obtained by Spotlight on America. They're going to farmers and ag operators close to potentially tainted bases.
Well, imagine if your neighbor called and said, hey, I'm going to start sending toxic waste into your backyard, just letting you know. That's ridiculous, right?
Scott Faber is with the Environmental Working Group. He pointed out the DoD has no plans yet to handle contamination that's leaked beyond its bases, which leaves communities across the country facing an array of troubling questions.
We don't know how much of this irrigation water is being used to water animals that we either eat or the products of which we ultimately eat. We should know that. It shouldn't be a secret whether or not the food we're eating might be contaminated with a toxic chemical.
To try to get answers, we filed multiple Freedom of Information requests with the Pentagon and Department of Agriculture, asking for the names and addresses of every farm being notified about potential contamination on their properties. And we were stunned by what we discovered, a list of more than 50,000 people, farmers from every state.
So I want to show you this. This is just 200 pages of individuals whose information was handed over to the DoD.
We took our findings to Michigan Congressman Dan Kildee, the co-creator of the Congressional PFAS Task Force.
When you see the scope of the number of people whose information was handed over, what does it say to you about this problem?
It really says that what we've discovered about PFAS so far is just the tip of the iceberg. And we know that PFAS, when it's in an underground plume, doesn't stop at the border of the base. It goes wherever it wants to go.
Kildee says the biggest problem with PFAS right now is that these chemicals don't yet qualify for the federal funding that's typically used to clean up the nation's most toxic sites. Without that, he says, communities impacted by PFAS contamination don't have many options, while the military drags its feet.
It sets a pretty bad example for other polluters when an agency of the federal government itself is the polluter. They ultimately said, okay, we'll clean up the bases that we own and operate. That's not good enough. They need to clean up the problem.
Right now, that toxic problem remains buried just below the ground across the country.
It's a huge problem.
Anna Reed, staff scientist with the Natural Resources Defense Council, told us the DoD is minimizing the problem by only sending letters to farms within just a mild downgrade of potentially impacted bases, and only to those whose groundwater testing turned up unacceptable levels for just 3 of the thousands of PFAS chemicals that exist.
I think that a lot of times when people want to downplay the issue, they concentrate on 1 or 2 chemicals and ignore the rest, and that's a big problem.
More than a dozen times over the past year, Spotlight on America has requested interviews to talk about PFAS contamination with military leadership. None of them have agreed to an interview.
What would you say about the fact that the DoD is not willing to sit somebody in front of us to answer questions about their efforts to clean this up and how long it's going to take?
They need to be more transparent. That's been a real challenge. It's a game of whack-a-mole with the DoD on this question.
The military says it's taking a proactive approach, and a report just made public shows they've notified more than 2,000 agricultural operations since the new law went into effect earlier this year. But we've already found some holes in their efforts. Based on the DoD's own reporting, not one farm around Cannon Air Force Base got a letter warning of potential contamination this year. But we know that's not the case. Art Scott showed us the one he received in April. An obvious oversight that he said doesn't instill confidence in the military's ongoing efforts. Art admits he's battle-weary from his fight to make the DoD take accountability. But he says he's never going to quit. He's taking the military to court, seeking compensation for what he's lost, and a recognition that the damage he claims they caused has cost him almost everything.
Considering that the Department of Defense is responsible for this, is a letter enough to farmers like you?
To me, they ought to go out into the countryside and actually take care of it. I'm fighting Goliath. That's what I'm up against.
When it comes to the most vulnerable members of our society, children are at the very top of the list. They depend on the rest of us to make decisions in their best interest, including about the very first foods they eat to make sure they give them the best chance at a healthy life. But we discovered, unfortunately, that may be where we're letting them down. Our months-long investigation uncovered troubling new information about toxic metals in some of the nation's most popular brands of baby food. Unsettling information for new moms like Carlene Thomas.
You see the brand recognition of names that have been around for years and years, decades and decades, and you assume because they've lasted, they're safe and that they're doing the right thing.
A congressional report released this past winter found that top brands of baby food contain toxic heavy metals like lead and arsenic. It called out the companies for reckless disregard for the health of babies.
It felt uncomfortable to know that brands that we trust that are in the store aren't so trustworthy after all.
The risk of heavy metals in baby food is a settled issue. These metals are extremely toxic to infants and children.
To get a dose of reality about the seriousness of the problem, we visited Dr. Philip Landrigan, director at the Center for Public Health and Common Good at Boston College. We're talking about the nation's leading manufacturers of baby food. And with that goes this narrative. My mom fed it to me, I fed it to my kids, I'm fine, my kids are fine, what's the big deal?
The metals don't make the children obviously sick, but the chemicals are in their body and the chemicals are doing damage. They're changing DNA in certain cells in the body and increasing risk of cancer in the case of arsenic. It's silent damage, and people just need to understand that silent damage is real damage.
Real damage the Food and Drug Administration may have failed to prevent. Spotlight on America tracked down the scientists and food safety advocates who sounded the alarm years ago, only they say to be blown off.
We did that work in 2017, and it's been 4 years.
Dr. Sean Callan led the team at Denver's Ellipse Analytics, which did the first comprehensive tests of hundreds of baby food brands. Callan's lab partnered with the nonprofit Clean Label Project, led by Jackie Bowen, and released their findings. In the aftermath, they had one conference call with top-ranking FDA officials and hoped it would spark change.
After we had that initial call, I sent several follow-up emails of, hey, we can help you do this. What if we do this? All to which we didn't receive a response to.
Callan and Bowen sent this email to the FDA with tables of evidence, including their finding that 50 baby food products had levels of arsenic higher than the FDA had ever detected in previous studies. The agency, they say, fell silent, and even today, that silence remains. We tried repeatedly to speak with FDA officials, but they declined interview requests, telling us the agency has been working on baby food safety since before 2017, and pointing to its Closer to Zero program announced this year, setting goals to lower the levels of heavy metals in baby foods over the next several years. Baby food makers have made similar pledges on reform, but back in Denver, Bowen and Callan say they've been ignored by manufacturers since 2016.
It's not even they chose not to do anything. What they chose to do is actually make public statements looking to discredit Clean Label Project.
We said, well, you have a problem. They said, well, no, we don't. So, well, no, here's objective third-party data showing that you have a problem. They're like, no, we don't. We have the highest quality product. We're like, yeah, well, we tested the whole industry, and objectively, no, you don't.
You might be wondering, is it possible to make baby food that contains no heavy metals? The answer, we discovered, is yes. Spotlight on America traveled to Columbus, Ohio, where a company called Nature's One is churning out infant formula that regularly tests zero for contaminants. Jay Hyman is their self-proclaimed activist CEO.
Yeah, it's a beautiful facility. Very, very proud of it.
Not only does the $40 million facility have cutting-edge technology to make the formula, it prioritizes testing for contaminants right on site. Why isn't everybody doing this if it works so well?
I just don't know. I don't know.
You can always control for contaminants.
Yes, we can always control contaminants.
which sometimes means making difficult decisions, adjusting on the fly to find the best suppliers, even discontinuing popular ingredients like chocolate and kale if clean products aren't available.
I think a lot of companies, they start going, well, I need this product, and then because our competitors are doing it, we want to keep up. And then before you know it, you're into the deep water on junky stuff because you're just trying to keep up with the competition.
As Jay Hyman continues what he calls his pathway to purity, and other industry players set off on theirs, the activist CEO is doubling down on putting babies ahead of the bottom line, even if it shutters his operation.
If we go out of business because other formula companies figure out, so be it. We've done our social duty here. Thank you very much. It was a good run. Now the world is better.
So you're okay with setting the bar and hoping everybody else follows?
Exactly.
The blueprint exists, but Hyman believes major manufacturers won't ultimately be willing to spend what it takes to produce heavy metal-free baby food across the board. That leaves moms like Carlene Thomas to fend for themselves.
That's unacceptable. What are we doing as a country if we're not protecting the most vulnerable people? How can we possibly be okay with that and letting that happen?
I'm Dwayne Pullman. They look and sound like relics of the past. But these chambers are offering a brighter future for America's veterans, Hall of Fame athletes, and countless others suffering from brain injuries.
You went through hell.
Yes, sir.
For retired Marine Sergeant Major Simon LeMay, hell arrived in 2009 and 2010 in Iraq and Afghanistan. Improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, claimed his best friend and maimed another.
Stepped on a pressure plate and lost both of his legs.
LeMay survived, but the explosions left him with invisible wounds of war.
I've had multiple IED exposures that have led to traumatic brain injury.
He returned home, disoriented and numb, struggling to simply speak. Military doctors treated his symptoms, but they could not heal his brain. LeMay descended into deep depression.
And one day I decided that I'd had enough, and I took a 9mm that I owned and I crawled underneath the bed skirt under the bed to try and end my life.
What stopped you?
My wife.
And I was losing it all because of the brain injury.
Retired Brigadier General Pat Maney was in this SUV that was sent airborne by an IED that exploded in Afghanistan in 2005. He too survived, but his traumatic brain injury made it difficult to walk, talk, and think.
I could read words, but I couldn't process what they meant.
General Maney was treated at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center for 15 months, but there was little improvement.
Their advice was tincture of time. Just be patient.
Running out of time and patience, family and friends convinced both Maney and LeMay to try hyperbaric oxygen therapy, or HBOT.
I had no idea what it was.
HBOT places patients inside hyperbaric chambers, delivering 100% oxygen under pressure, pushing it into the lungs, which carry it to damaged parts of the body, including the brain. Sections of this dormant and damaged brain, shown in blue, light up with green from new activity after HBOT. 40 Department of Defense studies over the past decade reveal significant improvement for combat vets suffering from traumatic brain injuries. According to TreatNow.org, a group that advocates for hyperbaric oxygen therapy, of the more than 4,000 combat vets with brain injuries who received HBOT, 8 out of 10 of them are showing significant improvement. Yet the Department of Defense and Veterans Administration, which continue to evaluate HBOT, have yet to approve it for treating more than 1 million veterans suffering from brain injuries. When I asked the VA why HBOT isn't used more, a spokesperson wrote, "There is insufficient medical evidence to recommend HBOT as a treatment for traumatic brain injury."
What we're all taught in medical school, there's nothing you can do for brain injury.
Dr. Paul Harch, the director of hyperbaric medicine at LSU in New Orleans and founder of HBOT.com, says the medical establishment has long resisted HBOT, even though there's plenty of evidence proving it can work.
And we can treat brain injury. And look, here's the evidence.
And warriors on the battlefield aren't the only ones trying to treat brain injuries.
How many concussions do you think you had?
Oh, more than you have fingers and toes.
Legendary Hall of Fame linebacker Dave Robinson led the Green Bay Packers to victory in Super Bowls I and II. Now he blames concussions on the field for causing decades of sleeplessness, agitation, and a murky memory.
I can talk to you and everything we said, tomorrow I forget most of it. I don't want to get to that point where I don't recognize my friends and don't know where I am.
Who's had a concussion? Show me.
Robinson and other football greats are on the board of directors for the Pro Football Retired Players Association, and they all admit they suffer from the effects of concussions.
Who worries about the long-lasting effects of all those concussions that you've received, even if it's just one? Are you worried?
Yeah.
Late last year, the retired players voted to try HBOT themselves. Not surprisingly, 80-year-old Dave Robinson is leading the way, receiving 60 HBOT treatments so far.
You feel better?
Yes.
More memory coming back.
For a man who's already enshrined in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, Robinson says he's not through battling. Only now he's replacing the pain on the field with a push to heal.
Is HBOT going to be part of your legacy now too?
I hope it is. I hope when I'm 100, I still have my memory, still have my faculties, can still move around, and I can tell people I owe it all to HBOT.
After 120 HBOT treatments, now retired General Maney returned to the bench as Judge Maney. He says he has his life back.
I'm a survivor thanks to hyperbaric oxygen therapy.
And retired Sergeant Major LeMay, who received HBOT too, says his despair has disappeared, replaced by plans for a future.
To feel like I want to be here, to have a future. You know, hope is set in our future, and that's what it's about.